what we're finding, it's good to know whom we're talking to and how they got connected into New Brunswick. So if I could just start with that, can you give us a little background on yourself and how you began your connection to New Brunswick?
Well, coming out of the activism of the 60s, I was living in South River, and like all the towns around the hub city, the center of African American culture was New Brunswick. It was a place where we could get our hair cut in a real barbershop and not in someone's kitchen. And the women found beauty salons, and there were great black churches, and places to shop, and soul food restaurants and bars and all.
And this was roughly about when you were living in?
Well, this is early 60s. It's 60, 61, and I was a part-time Rutgers student. You could pick any period around there because it took me about 22 years to graduate. So, but the point is, I did.
And just for the record, in which program?
Political science.
Right.
Yeah. With Professor Baker and that crowd. Some really good people. Well, anyway, the anti-poverty program, as we moved down in the 60s, Lyndon Johnson, Great Society, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and the designation of Middlesex County as a grantee, again, added to some of the excitement. Community organization, neighborhood service centers. So after working for DuPont in Parlin for 5 years, I left in 1965 to come over here to be the Director of Citizenship Education under the anti-poverty program. The name of it was the Middlesex County Economic Opportunities Corporation. So that gave me a direct involvement, voter registration, citizenship education, and all the law breaking of partisan voter registration. But in any event, that's...
And you became head of that agency?
Head of just that one department.
Right.
In 65?
In 65, citizenship education. Voter reg, citizenship education, the whole thing. And a neighborhood service center was opened on Nielsen Street. And so there are a lot of great levels of activism going on in the city. The civil rights movement. The Rutgers students were very, very involved.
And what were your impressions of New Brunswick at that time?
Well, New Brunswick, again, I have to go back to what I said earlier. It was the center of African American culture in the region. So, like our family on our street, we were the only black family on the street in South River. Well, we spoke some Polish, some Hungarian, some Italian. It was insufficient to, even though my grandfather's house was the first one on the street, we still had the League of Nations there. And our earliest lessons in terms of getting along with people of a variety of backgrounds. We went to school together, we played ball, we were good friends.
Okay. So actually, just so we can continue the chronology, maybe you can just take us in an overview fashion after becoming the head of the anti-poverty office. Maybe you can just take us forward on
Well,
And then we'll go back.
There were many great issues, and they involved starting with the New Brunswick Housing Authority, which we'll recall now about 1,000 people living on about an acre of land in 4 buildings, poorly maintained. We argued designed for failure.
This was Brunswick Homes or
the Brunswick Homes, Memorial Homes.
Memorial Homes, right.
Now, it was a very important piece of real estate, and some of us argued that that was just an interim step for, you remember the urban renewal process was in full swing. So they cleared that area, which were mostly homeowners, African Americans, whites, and some Puerto Ricans, because the other groups had not begun to come. The Dominicans weren't here at the time, Mexicanos, no, Puerto Ricans. And in that area were African American homeowners right on what they called Burnett Street, Memorial Parkway. In those homes, we saw that.
Now, this was the neighborhood that was then demolished to put up memorial homes. Is that?
This was the area that was demolished to put up memorial homes.
Okay.
It was sold as better housing,
Mm-hmm.
a better situation, slum clearance.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the Home News on its editorial page had what their forum was, what they believed in. One of the things was slum clearance, urban renewal. And, the cliche had come up already then that urban renewal was Negro renewal. And this was a very critical set of decisions for the city of New Brunswick. And we could see the sketch of a plan emerging to take back that very potentially valuable land along Route 18. So over the years, I guess the housing authority went up could have been 59, 60, whatever, but they had a density that was greater than Central Harlem. So you could see that there was something there in terms of the built-in failure. I don't want to align myself with the people who say that 9/11 didn't take place. It's
right.
But simply locally, and I think it's borne out with the history that this was the earliest move to so-called revitalize New Brunswick. That was a key stroke. And you cannot have those 4 buildings, over 1,000 people, 8 floors, with 1 elevator in each building. So when the elevator was down, you had to lug it up to the 7th floor. There were no laundry facilities. The people had to go up to the corner where the Chinese had a combination cleaners laundry. You had to find places, get cabs. So the fact that those amenities were not built in, to me and others, was a sign that this was a temporary, a transitional stroke. There were no bathrooms on the ground level. So if the kids are out playing and you're on the 7th floor, your turn to bat comes, you run, the elevator door closes, boom. That's where you do it. Run back out, hope you didn't miss your turn. So they blamed the people for all these things. Said, oh, I have a very bad feeling when I hear that, because we still hear it today. Those were some of the finest people. They were middle class African Americans, upwardly striving. Many of them had very good social work, teacher type jobs. The initial, if someone could get the initial resident at Memorial Homes, the best the African American community could offer. Essentially, and when I say African American, there were a minority of Puerto Ricans also there, so I don't need to. So you looked at that corridor, which is a very important corridor, close into the central business district. People making complaints about the crime rate, having so many, over the years, the middle class moved out of there. And the tenancy was not something that they really were concerned about. So there were political connections or whatever to get into the homes. The supervision, the security, soon it developed a reputation where if New Brunswick police were assigned there, they were on punishment duty. Nobody wanted to work at the homes. And so it developed a real stigma. So looking at that corridor, you look at it and you say, hey, that was the place it began, and for good and bad. Obviously something had to be done. But what has been missing from the beginning of time to the present day is an approach that includes interracial teamwork, an approach that is cross-cultural, that is integrated economically. That vision was never presented by the folks who had the authority to act. Their dreams could come true. We see what their dream, the result of the dream is. We see that result. But the consequences that have negatively impacted the community are not as clearly seen or understood by someone who comes in from Highland Park or East Brunswick to go to a lovely state theater, have a great meal at some of these great restaurants.
And actually, if I could fast forward,
Go ahead.
Ultimately the Memorial Homes, reaches such a point of
Yes.
disinvestment and
Absolutely.
that it's knocked down under
Imploded.
HUD Hope 6, which was,
Yes.
this was true in other, just to get your
it's
comments or
not as
observations.
bad as Pruitt-Igoe, but go ahead.
So the towers went down, and there were certain, I guess, townhouse-style apartments built, and then people were relocated. So just to get your perspective on the post-Memorial Homes.
Don't forget the party that, if I can just roughly call it, that the establishment had on top of the Hyatt Hotel on the day that Memorial Homes was imploded.
No kidding.
They had a full-blown party.
For that purpose,
For
to
that
watch,
purpose,
to watch it?
absolutely. To watch the homes go up.
Hmm.
So if we didn't understand before, it was clearly communicated. They did build some additional housing on that site. And is essentially answered the question that we raised before. If people had these little simple walk-ups, community condominiums or whatever, there would be no need to pee in the elevator. That the structure dictated the terms of the living conditions to the tenants. And I don't care how great you are. I was tutoring, I remember, and I'll never forget this. Franklin Torres, one of the brightest kids around, and when I would drive him back from the library or some school activity, he knew that I didn't want to go up the elevator with him. And as we returned, I said, you okay? This is a building 4. You okay, Franklin? He said, oh yeah, my mother's, you see her up there? And they had this chain link fence type grid on one side, which is another message. Another message. His mother would be there. And I get out of the car and here comes Franklin. But Franklin knew this guy is afraid to go up the stairs with him. Not the going up, but the coming back. So
if I can
go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned clearly this had a terrible effect on the immediate neighborhood when it was built, and then ultimately deteriorated into an abject slum, in part because
Right.
it was designed that way.
Yeah,
with
in our
limitation.
opinion, sure.
And then you said, well, there was some glimmerings of, they wanted to redevelop along Route 18, which got your antenna up, but maybe if I can just, now let's think about, because it happened not that much later with, the city now, J&J becomes involved, they want to redevelop, and there's an American Cities plan. So if I can just get your perspectives on the post-memorial home within the city's efforts at redevelopment and your perspective on it.
Well, a planning process. It's like my opinion about the new Brunswick High School. The building has to emerge from the curriculum. The building has to emerge. The structure has to emerge from the needs of the students and our philosophy as to what we plan to do and how this will impact our lives. You don't build a building and then say, hey kids, guess what? This is the fanciest high school in New Jersey. Get in there, get going. Doesn't work that way. I would quarrel for a second with you because you seem to bring J&J into the picture with the American Cities study. The only long-term memory in this town is Johnson & Johnson. From 1888 forward, the only long-term. And I think it's had a tremendous positive impact, just that name, because it's one of the most respected brands in American business history. Sadly, unfortunately, the leadership at that time had insufficient grounding, insufficient awareness, insufficient commitment to democratic principles when they turned their face to the community in a democratic society. So the most powerful, resourceful, long-term activists was Johnson & Johnson. They only came out from their sub rosa existence after the heavy, undemocratic blows were struck down with Memorial Homes. The campaign to, in a sense, assault those people who lived there, who worked hard, produced many college graduates. That was just an ongoing, drug-infested public. It was a regular tagline. They were there too. They came out, you're right, with American Cities Corporation and establishment that runs it tomorrow, Devco. Here's what we're going to do now. The Hyatt Hotel, that was probably the first proposal, that old circle down there, and the Route 18 extension. Looking at the Route 18 extension right now, I'm not talking about the first. Who would quarrel with that? One of my favorite departments in the state government is the Department of Transportation. The job they did coming through New Brunswick, from the junction of Route 1 all the way through to 287, was wonderful. Extraordinary piece of work. Enhancing the aesthetics, everything, the flow of traffic.
Talking about the current.
The current, not the first Route 18 extension.
So maybe we could go back to the first, Route 18.
Yeah, we suffered all along. It's hard because my relationship and view of Johnson & Johnson is so strong on one side as a business. You will never go wrong if you pattern your business after Johnson & Johnson. Never go wrong. But their view, their face to the community, where they count their money, lacks the sensitive, creative leadership. Their giving is tremendous, but it's subtle and nuanced. And in a town like this, you gotta be out. You walk around and you try to talk some BS to these kids who are 12 and 13, they'll call you out. Now, here, I couldn't count my money in a place like this and look down the street at Eric B. Chandler and see the women and children in line waiting for an appointment for well baby services, having waited 2 or 3 months. Not where I count my money. I'm never going to let that happen. You could be subtle and nuanced in terms of your giving to support that, that's fine. But the job has to get done.
Now, I mentioned this respectfully. It's been, I guess, some other individuals involved, speak about, in fact, how Johnson & Johnson and Devco and reached out to the community, with meetings and having people on the board and
I was on the
and
Devco
so on.
board
And
for a
in fact, you had a Devco, and which was doing the physical development, and then you had New Brunswick Tomorrow, which was looking at some of the social. So your perspective on that? Because that's one take of.
Well, they knew what they wanted to do. As the kids say from Jump Street, they knew where they wanted to go. Now,
Which was the physical.
Oh, absolutely. And to diminish the African American presence and the presence of poor people in the central business district. You don't move the welfare office out to Howe Lane. You don't get rid of the YMCA the YWCA, okay, you put a bank and a theater. You don't do that and argue that we had community people at the table. And as if to say that they agreed with that. You could do those things, and at some level, it turns out that those were good decisions. But there was no quid pro quo. We'll take that swimming pool from the Y, both pools, the YMCA, which is George Street Playhouse right now, and the YWCA, which was a core of women activism. That board, those women were strong in their support on behalf of poor children. So you don't take down two pools in the name of it makes more sense, and it did make more sense. In the end, grudgingly, I yield that point because it made that area, the arts, the business, more of a comprehensive area. It made sense not to put a swimming pool for poor kids right in the middle of that.
And what should have happened would have been, all right, but then you keep these institutions and facilities, you make sure it's
that they will
established
be
elsewhere.
available elsewhere.
And in
in
fact,
the community.
was not.
Did not happen.
So no, there is no YMCA or YWCA
No.
location anymore for
No.
anybody.
You cannot do that and continue to argue that New Brunswick tomorrow is taking care of the community.
Mhm.
John Heldrich used to say the software, and that Devco is doing the hardware. These issues are not complicated. If we just roll back in the Home News and Star Ledger and look at the recent comments of Devco announcing the progress of the construction of the new high school. In what community could we live in? Could you go to East Brunswick and the construction official is going to tell the public about the progress of the school? That's the Board of Education superintendent. Well, we have John Jones here from ABC Construction, but that'll be at a Board of Education meeting. And their feet would be held to the fire. Why is there no swimming pool in the most expensive high school in the history of the state? Why don't these children have a swimming pool? Why is there no in-school health care center? I don't mean an area, glorified, go to the nurse station.
You mean like what Gloria Bonilla-Santiago developed down in Camden, having services as part of the school?
Absolutely.
building?
But there are better examples in Newark where they have complete federally qualified health centers in the elementaries and the high schools. So the kids who have some kind of lesion, some kind of discharge, could go talk to a health care professional and get information to deal with it. So, the long road from memorial homes to what we have now, one of the most spectacular sights, driving, I guess that is south on George Street, or coming up New Street and you come face to face with the Heldrich Hotel. It will knock you down. It will knock you over when you lack the information as to what it cost us in a moral sense to get to that place. We remember the old Roger Smith Hotel, the old welfare hotel.
Was that the one across the street?
That's it right there.
Across the street.
The same ground as Heldrich.
There was a days in that
Can you
one.
talk a little, which was replaced by a multi-use hotel office,
Right.
condo residence.
Yes. The owner struggled. He had to become a welfare hotel because he had no money to do it. That's why these hotels and motels on the roads close to the cities, you see a million cars there during the day. It's not because we have that much business. No, they're welfare hotels. Now, again, I think Christopher, I think the name of the gentleman who owned it, kind of runs past me. But he was bombarded with the same public relations suit package that Memorial Homes faced. Openly called a welfare hotel.
What might have been an alternative
That the
use
people,
of the block? Let's say.
just like it's being used right now, not an alternative, a real hotel. If they had embraced him and brought him in and said, listen, under these terms and conditions, we'll help you do this. Now, are you financially set to take a percentage of this ownership? Fine. We want to leave you whole. Take a look at this proposal that we have.
So the alternative would have been to bring forth the
Fold
existing
him in.
owner into the new.
Treat him as family. Bring him in. And then you could say reasonably, accurately, morally, that we weren't there to displace and run these people out. I'll remember for probably forever, sadly. They had, you brought up Anton Nelson. I remember a meeting, it could have been, where was that meeting? It was somewhere close to J&J. Could have been whatever, but they were talking about the initial proposal for the Hyatt Hotel. And Anton, with his brilliant, sensitive self, proposed an alternative to the J&J proposal.
This is Tony Nelson.
Yes.
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 Dick Sellers was in charge of J&J, a big, handsome guy. He knew the business. He was tough. He knew what had to be done for that great company. When he stepped across the street to be involved in the community, he was a fish out of water. Here's Nelson getting up to propose the alternative after Dick Sellers and his crew made their presentation. And obviously the crowd was for Nelson. And Dick Sellers said something that I could actually see him saying this right now. It hurts so bad. Dick Sellers said, that's a great plan to Nelson. He said, but the only plan I have money for is this one. There was your community involvement. Yes, Nelson did succeed in knocking the scale of the hotel down and some of the other little amenities. But I looked in his face and I could have cried with him. The way this brilliant scholar was abused that night by the people who claimed to be acting in our behalf, I wanted to cry too.
Now, David, you served on the Devco board. Roy Epps was on NBT. I don't know if he was
Yes.
ever on Devco. And obviously, I assume you must have raised some of these issues at board meetings. I'm just wondering, Well, if you did, and what kind of responses
I
or
didn't
answers
stay
you would
there
get?
long. It was clear that the meetings were really essentially designed to put the community input and primatur on what they had already essentially planned. And when George, is it George? Yeah, Zoffinger came out in the paper, again, it's back to this high school thing, the way he talked about it. I had a public fight with him over that, and I did resign from Devco. But he knew better than I did what direction the high school was going in. And I said, how could these people be telling us? And I'm not even going to say they should have to live here. I don't want to be that provincial to say, well, Lavender doesn't live here. No, let's deal with his ideas. What the blank are you telling New Brunswick about a high school board? Have you usurped the authority of the Board of Ed, the mayor, and the others? Sure, you're going to build it.
Actually, back a little on the high school. I mean, besides, you mentioned some of the limitations of like not having a full-fledged health facilities. Do you think it should have been placed elsewhere? What might have been an alternative?
Oh, you mean the school or
with the new high school being built? What would have been a more community input?
See, we're not in government, and they built it on a site that needed to be cleaned up in terms of the environmental protection agency. Why did they do that? If that site could be approved, the state would have to pay for the cleanup. So at some level, the decision had nothing to do with education. It's just
fortuitous.
Yeah, this is millions of bucks, and let's clean up the site. Where do you put a high school? First of all, I just don't believe in building any school for more than 500 kids. Okay? So now they're talking thousands of kids. So for me, I'm going to have the schools spread around. Smaller scale, density, so the teachers and principals can know every kid.
I guess it's carrying forth the memorial homes, just
absolutely
on scale kind of.
This is just, and I had my tour. Again, that's my grandmother used to say, June, don't cry. She'd always say, you're a crybaby. I said, this is okay, Mom. I wanted to cry when I got back to my car to see that expenditure and to be in a place that was so cold. There was no one else there but the construction people, Gene and the construction manager, and they gave me they knew what my feelings were, so they took me around to be impressed, and I was impressed at what we could do.
But if I could, your perspective on Hiram Market, and could it have been preserved? I mean, what your thoughts on looking back?
From time to time, because I usually don't get out of the daycare until 7:30. And one of the things that I like to do is to go, I used to go walk it, but get in the car and just drive through there. Because it's so quiet, it reminds you of some of the areas in the East and West Village and other very quiet places in New York. I kind of love what they did with Hiram Market. Now, because it's just so soft It's so comforting. It has such a good feel to it. You know, we're not developing something that says, hey, look at me. And I get a feeling that the people who live there kind of enjoy it. They know each other, and several times I've been there, invited for various things. They know their neighbors. So as to the history of Hiram Market, we needed to pay probably a little more attention to how important that was in terms of the city's economic development. But I would say that we got a pretty good result, given the forces that were against something more historic. The battle that the Frog and the Peach had to fight. One of the things that sets the tone there is that beautiful, understated, elegant restaurant where you see people with Connecticut license, New York chauffeurs, to a place that's not saying, hey, look at me, except in the kitchen, except in the service, except in the cleanliness and the attention to detail at the bar. They were fought tooth and nail by city leaders. They had some prior information and they picked their spot to put their restaurant. And a glorious accomplishment.
Now, were you involved much with John Lynch while he was?
Yes, John Lynch and I have had a long history. I ran against him a couple times. We developed a level of respect for each other. While he was incarcerated, we would correspond. And I sent him a subscription to Atlantic Monthly magazine. I said, John, these are some of the magazines you should have been reading. All along. And a whole set of other things to kind of let him know that, nobody is all one thing. And you're there, you made contributions, we might have fought like cats and dogs, but we're not going to forget you or kick you while you're down. We fought, and John Lynch was, the thing I loved about him is he had a temper. And if you said something in a public forum, you could expect to have a message, in the office, or a letter that he would send over by a courier. He'd send you a letter, and I'd read the letters, and I wouldn't copy them. I'd just take a Post-it, put it on there, send it back to him in mail. I'd say, John, if you really want me to have this, send it back. I don't have any letters. Never sent me back. But I talked to him. He called me after he's on in a halfway house now. Has weekends off.
We actually interviewed him.
Oh, did you? Okay. A hell of a batter. I remember him playing either shortstop or second base. A tough Irish kid. He would fight you to the end. And he was a tremendous leader. It's too bad, again, and my criticism there is the same as my criticism of the J&J leaders before Burke. We got to divide that.
Talk a little about that.
Burke was the transition person at J&J. The reason that you see now they're one of the top three in terms of environment, women, community involvement. That's Burke. That comes from Burke. once Burke got in and they looked around and he said,
And for the record,
Jim Burke.
Jim Burke came in roughly when?
Oh, that's a good point.
Early 80s, late 70s?
Maybe, probably early.
He was the one who dealt with the Tylenol.
With the Tylenol.
Thing early
Classic.
on in his.
That was no accident. I don't mean the crime,
Mhm.
but the way he handled that was just part of his nature.
Mhm.
He turned and developed the Burke Scholars. He listened, you know, Heldrich and the rest of them, but they wanted to improve New Brunswick High School. And again, they had no idea. They didn't listen. But in any event, Burke looked at the community with a different eye and a different level of sophistication, education, and there was a generational change. Burke looked around and saw how few African Americans were involved there, how few other minorities, Jews and others. And he called them in one day, his troops, and he said, guess what? We're going to be number one in this area. And he brought people in. Harold Sims, former head of the Urban League after Whitney Young died, Harold Sims came in. His job was to scour America and the world to bring in minority folks. And they did it and almost received all kinds of awards. And they had a lot of things to overcome, but Burke just said, hey, look, no mas.
Your perspective on Rutgers and all this with respect to the redevelopment?
I don't think Rutgers was ever recognized or treated the way it should have been, because Rutgers is our central asset. Yes, the economic downturn hit us, New Brunswick, but when you have a university of the level of Rutgers in your midst, those jobs will continue for the local folks. It's like the way the hospital, there are jobs for the indigenous population. And I don't think Rutgers, I go after Lynch on this one, because they wanted to, what is the word? When you take something, break it up, cannibalize it. Mm-hmm. Rutgers. McGreevy, break it up and do this and that. Rutgers is the reason anybody really talks about New Brunswick. Go to the landlords in terms of the place, the apartments, the millions that come in from rents alone, all across New Brunswick. And the reason they move all across New Brunswick is that they can't have cars if they live on campus. If you're living off campus, these kids want their cars. So Rutgers, remember the big fight moving the bookstore to where it was? Rutgers was just dealt with like a stepchild. And I think it's just, again, those old leaders, anti-intellectual folks, still going back to the days of Professor Yesselson and the others in that group who argued the way they did against the Vietnam War and a whole host of other things. Turned out to be right. We didn't have a good match. If we had those forward-thinking leaders at J&J and someone of Mason Gross's character, of his stature, they could sit down and really, and it would be Mason Gross who would say, well, what are we going to do about the folks who live here? And someone on the other end would have been there to listen. They have just begun to scratch the surface as to what Rutgers has to give to this community.
But do you think New Brunswick was much on Rutgers' radar? I mean, I hear what you're saying. You know, Rutgers is a key economic.
That's a very good point. That is a very good point. Not until McCormick, sadly, inexplicably. Fran Lawrence was not, and prior to that. And Ed was, yeah, he, you know, it was premature. I mean, it was just, no. Still that kind of public ivy attitude. Still that kind of attitude. But
of what, there but not there?
yeah, that let the folks kind of run around, do the things they want to do. We're here for the Nobel Prize. We're here for
So not being engaged with the city.
tremendous error through the whole process. Tremendous error. Now it's just begun to kind of develop. Alvin Rockoff. You should have seen the battle we had. Well, anyway, I was on the Board of Governors for a while, and I was also chair of the Board of Trustees for a couple of terms. And it's just amazing, the two perspectives of the city. And I think now that the economic crunch has hit the way it has, a lot of kids in New Jersey are staying home and to go here, which means the attention of their parents is also here. Rockoff Residential, right here. Look at that. You can't be any deeper into the city than that. And again, the opportunity for more Rutgers, not just physical, but emotional presence, because it follows. If our kids are going to be down on George Street, across from Davidson Liquor, we're going to make sure that we know what's happening on George Street. That whole tract of land across from Rockoff, George Street, to New, up to Tabernacle Baptist Church to Nielsen Street is another huge opportunity for a partnership, where the Abundant Life Church is, Davidson Liquor, Seatown,
Right.
and that little cemetery up on the
Right.
other end. A tremendous opportunity to do something big for Rutgers and New Brunswick.
You started to mention but your perspective on the hospital and its connection to the redevelopment.
Hospital means jobs to us, and we talk about healthcare and all that. Their focus is kind of somewhere else in terms of that issue, but there are jobs there. I think they are the number one employer of local people, but not far from Rutgers. Rutgers is up there also. Rutgers, essentially 10-month jobs. Hospital is 3 shifts a day.
What about the role of the churches? We have many long-standing
Yes, we
churches
do.
in town.
And we have a passing of those old great leaders who had ties to the political establishment, not only here but statewide. I look at Henry Hildebrand at Mount Zion, passed. I look at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Lonnie Ford, passed. And some of the new people are commuters. I know at Mount Zion, the minister he's a commuter. Can you imagine that? But City Hall has done a beautiful job I'm going to say, perversely beautiful in putting all, essentially, the black clergy in their hip pocket.
Actually, one of the things we observed, even people who left New Brunswick often would have some tie back, including, like you say, commuting to church.
That's a very good point.
So New Brunswick wasn't entirely off their radar.
No, that's a very
Or
interesting.
moved to Highland Park, you know.
That's
so
a very good
They're
point.
not there, but you kind of.
Because it takes us back to the beginning. You remember New Brunswick being the cultural center for African Americans in the surrounding areas, and so we come back to that. The folks who grew up left, but come back to the churches. And it would be difficult. I could probably name the churches, maybe only 4 that would have a predominant local membership. Most of them, Abundant Life, certainly the people commute. You can see by those cars that are out there. Buster, commuters. So it's that emotional tie to the church. Ebenezer, Sharon Baptist, those were the old churches my grandmother used to talk about, those ministers and how they'd come and help people and all that.
If I could talk some on transferability, and maybe if I could just start that dialogue where I'm getting a sense from yourself that your argument of difference is less with some of the things that happened,
Yeah.
but that this process didn't have, in your perspective, a real dialogue with the community. You know, nor not just dialogue, but that in a bit of quid pro quo, that more resources were not
Right.
extended to the community's needs and institutions. Is that a fair, and maybe other, what would be other takeaways, or do you want to elaborate on that thought, and what would be some other takeaways about looking back with 20/20 hindsight,
Yeah.
what should have been done differently?
Well, if I counted my money here, I would have the best bilingual, bicultural programs in the nation. I would embrace these children. If they knew what I know from the daycare perspective and watching my kids grow up. I got a wonderful kid graduating from engineering this year. She came here dressed as a little boy in the arms of someone else her mother gave her to get on that plane to get to the United States of America. Illegally. Call it whatever you want. But her mother had sufficient sense to look at what was going on in Oaxaca and say, hell with this. My baby's not growing up here. Put her, dress her as a little boy, got some papers, sent her on. Most of the Mexicans in this town.
I guess I can build off of that. So, what could have, should have been done that would have leveraged off of this characteristic?
As we saw that trend, and most of the Mexicans here come from Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca, and the poorest, and that was a message for not only the schools, the healthcare, the whole deal. And I know these things cost money. But if we open up an emergency room, we know that that's money. We needed to, if you didn't want to have the Mexican-American festival on George Street for the weekend, like they have the Feast of San Gennaro, if you didn't want to do that, then let's go to the schools and say, here's what we know about the demographics of the folks from the state of Oaxaca. We know they're poor, yada, 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 yada. here's what we need to be thinking about in the public schools. You know why? Because Mary Carmen Daza, this student who's coming out of engineering this year, well, in May, we need her. That's a knowledge worker there. We do not see that kind of production, stick-to-itiveness, an illiterate mother saying that my kid, I'm in the shadows, but here it is. This is the new group of folks. And we didn't have the sense to identify them and basically say, these are our kids. Because they are. They know nothing else. You send these kids back to Mexico who came here, they don't know anything about Mexico. So, the schools, the healthcare, I want to run those two together and open up the dialogue. J&J has access, and I'll tell you, to the foundation. I guess is Governor Kane still the chair of the foundation?
Sure, it was, I know.
Okay. But they have a special set aside for New Brunswick. And some of that could have been moved to make this place, we could have, I don't know, are zebras good swimmers? I think they are. But we could have had our own, swimming group of kids coming out of elementary themed schools where these kids would go to school 7 o'clock in the morning with their parents. And for early session, have their whatever it is, greeting, eating, and whatever else, get in the swimming pool with their instructors until 9 o'clock. Come out, shower, go to class. We could have a model theme situation where we could roll these kids out and say, hey, guess what? This costs us a ton of money, but here's another example of what's possible. And in a sense, to kind of put a positive face on all of this. Right now, we struggle. We struggle. They built a new school, Lord Sterling School. It's a factory. Look at that school, stuck right up on that corner. And they wouldn't go the extra distance to take the Exxon off the corner.
Oh, right.
Take that Exxon off the corner and those other 6 properties and build these kids a beautiful playground. Go up there and look at what you see as a playground.
All right, so that's clearly, an important element. It's more than just a dialogue. It's embracing the indigenous population
and bringing them along.
What about in terms of, clearly the emphasis has been on new construction? Do you think with our 2020 hindsight we could have kept more of the existing stock and had more frog in the peaches and interesting old buildings and walks and what have you? Is that something with our 2020 hindsight perhaps?
Absolutely. You look up and down the line and you see this, and I heard a conversation one day where they were demolishing yet another place, and they said, well, I can't recall who was saying this, but let's get the demolition done in a hurry before somebody finds some chicken bones. Now that's their attitude. If you find some old arrows from Native Americans or something, you'd have to stop construction. Right. So again, that generational problem, and it goes back to, and John and I, Heldrich, we've had a long relationship, a rocky relationship since the 60s. A sweet guy, who will really help you on any personal issue. But ideologically, he is always going to be a rock solid conservative, which is okay if that meant fiscal policy and international relations. Okay, I could accept that. But you can't be rock solid in favor of continuing slavery as a conservative. And I just feel he was such a critical person. And J&J always respects their leaders. And it tells you something about having resources when you can give a guy a town to play with. The town, okay, your thing is New Brunswick. What? That's what I would have said. What? But he said, gee, just New Brunswick. I'm sure that's what he said. But so his lack of enlightenment on a lot of these issues and his fear of the community building process led to a lot of problems. Not going to find a stronger, more committed, family man or anything like that.
Well, what about his program for jobs and the fact that he got involved in the SETC and all of that?
I thought that was very positive.
And do you feel that he, going through this process, he may have understood more of what
sure
community issues are?
Yeah, I'm sure he grew during that process.
But you think not enough?
Not enough and too late. Too late. Mm-hmm. These schools could be the real thing, but they're not if you spend any time in them.
The arts have clearly become an important element in
which they should have.
And brings in people from afar,
absolutely,
etc., and feeds the restaurants, which is important.
It's part of it.
If I could continue with the theme of the community being involved. I go to George Street. It looks like exit 8A has come. Do you think that's something that, your perspective on the arts and Brunswick's redevelopment, and also the arts and the community?
Well, and I'm glad you put it that way because it is two separate areas. We want comprehensive redevelopment. And so every asset does not have to focus on the needs of the community. Having an asset, it's like the State Theater. It's a great sign that we have an entity that can attract people, that can urge people to come here and enjoy those offerings. When I interact with them, however, with the leaders, the arts leaders, I always try to emphasize that your programs for the school kids are great, but we don't want them to learn to be another type of consumer. Now, the consumer of the arts. I want the kids to get up on stage, and they do have some areas. I want them to know what is a Stradivarius. They might not ever be able to buy one, but it's not permanent. I want them to know who he is, just like they know who Michael Jordan is. Have an appreciation for what folks can do. Aida, Bohem, Carmen. I want those names to be within their general ability to discuss, from having played a part in school. from having gone to the State Theater and having a tryout for a part for school production. So I want their families in the chairs, but I want them up on the stage and in the pit. I like what Alvin Ailey does with their school. They bring those kids in there. They don't have to be stars, but they understand the discipline of what's trying to be done. And so we are moving more in that direction. I saw a beautiful publication from, I think it was Mason Gross, where they now have programs for children to come in and learn. Now, you have to pay, but that asset wasn't available before.
Right. Yeah,
These
they've
kids
done a
are-
lot of outreach.
That whole new program, the
Mhm.
person leading that is just tremendous. It's going to catch on after a while. I've been trying to encourage a couple of parents. I have a couple of kids who could really benefit from that. And you want to be quiet in terms of saying, "Oh yeah, we'll pay for it if you make sure that you're there when the lessons are scheduled on time," and you know. But that's great, and that's just beginning. Again, scratch the surface of what the university is all about.
Any further perspectives?
Well, I'll give you a novel characterization of the process. A tale of two cities.
All right, that's one of my early favorites.
Right. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
See, this is the best of interviews. So.
I'll tell you, Professor Clem Price wrote a book for the Jersey Cultural Society, and I think it's Freedom Not Far Distant. And it has a chapter or a couple chapters on central Jersey, the greater New Brunswick, Middlesex area, and how difficult it was for African Americans who came into this area, and how active these slave catchers were. The process is never ending. The thorough and complete diminution of the African American community in New Brunswick. I mean, it's complete, obliterated through this process. Not necessarily deliberate. On my good days, I say that. But the result is, if you look around, and I'm conflicted on this point because I don't like to put people in groups where the only thing that holds them together is what they look like. So I generally reject the notion of an African American community. But for the purpose of this argument, people of color suffer greatly. But the whole result kind of put New Brunswick on the map in terms of what you can see. The physical development, again, let's go back, let's end as we began. Coming north on Route 18 and looking at the skyline of the city of New Brunswick. And an observer, an untrained eye, is doing cartwheels looking at that. An enormous accomplishment. even if we just restrict it to the brick, an enormous accomplishment. And peeling back that layer, you see the unfinished business. Maybe that's left for us, for the next generation. But the price was tremendous. Tremendous price.
So thank you. Really, thank you very much.
Hey, it seems like every 2 or 3 years I end up here talking about this.
You need to understand this.
Yeah. No.
We've interviewed, I guess now with you, 18 people, about an hour and a half to 2 hours each. Of course, John Heldrich, we had Kenneth Wheeler, we had Tony Nellison, we had mayors.
Including John Lynch.
Yeah,
Right.
keep doing it.
So if there's anyone else you think we might
And we
need
can
to
send
talk
you, we can
to.
send you a list. I
Yeah.
haven't seen it of.
We did, and Roy Epps,
Yes.
and Jeff Vega, and Chris Palladino, and Chris Folio.
Oh, yeah, Chris come up now.
Right.
Who was a former student of mine.
Yeah.
Oh, was
Actually, I met a former,
So-
Glenn Patterson was a former student.
Right.
So we have you to blame.
Well.
And John Lynch.
Maybe I'll exit left.
Right.
And if you have materials that perhaps you can share with us, that would be.
I'd like to pull out some of those articles when I was fighting with Heldrich.
Yeah.
I would.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Because part of this eventually is also maybe going to be some more data collection of articles, of
Yeah.
minutes of things or whatever. But,
Or the great, I'll tell you, I spoke at Records Hall. Is Records Hall still there?
Yes.
And this was this Martin Luther King? April 4th is Martin Luther King, right? When he was assassinated?
yeah, I don't recall.
I think
the
so.
exact date.
Well, we had a big meeting at Records Hall. And we were having problems with the poverty program leadership and control issues. It's a story of the problems with control. And I said, well, what we need to do is go out and march, because that was the thing, you know. And the paper said there were between 3,500 and 4,000 students who were following this guy, marching against racism.
Uh-huh.
And those were some heady days.
Yeah.
Could have used all that energy.
I remember when I first came to Livingston in 1971. It was a people in the planning program. There'd be a radical priest, quote unquote.
Okay, yeah.
It was a very different.
Yes.
And of course, Livingston was different. It would.
Yes.
We would shut down every Monday.
Right.
Is that right? For
Oh, you had Kwame
activism?
McDonald, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't he Kwame J.C. McDonald?
Let me thank you again. Really.
Yes,
Okay.
thank a lot,
And
David.
No problem.
This will be transcribed. You will get a copy.
Yeah, you'll get a copy
Okay.
to make sure it's.
And,
Good odds. I didn't say that.
we wouldn't have done our job. I want to have something that we synthesize from this in the New Brunswick Library.
Great.
People have to, so that's, I think both a video, maybe some panels with some pictures. I mean, people have short memories. And the young
Yes.
people, of course, they only know what they know.
Right.
That's true.
On that. All right.
Okay, so this.
Yeah, I'm supposed to have.
Trying to catch up on dead white males.